Denis Davidov was a bold Russian warrior, poet, and rebel, a true adventurer who lived for battle and storytelling. He led daring guerrilla raids against Napoleon, changing Russia's military tactics forever. His poetry was wild and full of life, earning praise from great writers like Pushkin. Though his writings were censored, his legacy endured. This memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, brings his thrilling first-hand stories to life, his battlefield victories, his fearless tactics, and his role in the Napoleonic Wars. A forgotten hero, finally rediscovered. These are his words. Let's begin. On the 9th of July, I dispatched him another courier, rhapsodizing about the advantages of concerted action, and concluding my report by humbly begging that my group be reinforced with the Cossack regiments under his command. In the meantime, from among the 200 prisoners whom we had freed, I chose 60 or so volunteers of medium height, and in the absence of Russian uniforms, I dressed them in French outfits and armed them with captured muskets, leaving them with Russian caps instead of shakos. We were still unaware of the fate of the capital, when on the 11th, Major Stepan Krapovitsky of the Volyn Regiment, a son of the leader of the local gentry, arrived in Ukhnov and informed us that Moscow had been occupied by the enemy. Although I had been expecting this event and had argued that it was inevitable as long as we continued our retreat along the Smolensk highway, nevertheless, the news shook me to the core, and my comrades were equally affected. However, since there was no point in becoming despondent, we questioned Major Krapovitsky, seeking further details. He told us he had left the army at Krasnaya Pokhra, that it had continued moving to protect the Kaluga road, that Moscow had been abandoned to the flames, but that no one in the army was giving any thought to peace. I trembled with relief and assured the local landowners and villagers that our country would be saved if Napoleon were to leave our army alone between Moscow and Kaluga, until it was reinforced by reserve armies and Don Cossacks. Provided the commander-in-chief adopted this policy, the outcome must surely be apparent to anyone with the least understanding of military science. I felt it as pointless to lecture the Ukhnov landowners about strategy any more than Columbus would have tried to explain astronomy to the American savages when he predicted to them the coming of a lunar eclipse. That evening, I received a letter from the civil governor of Kaluga, dated 8th September, containing the following passage. Everything has come to pass. Moscow is no longer ours. It is being consumed by flames. I received on the 6th assurances from the commander-in-chief at Podolsk that while protecting the Kaluga road, he will concentrate his efforts on the Smolensk highway. Do not fool around, Denis Vasilyevich. You have a great obligation. By covering Ukhnov, you will save the heart of our province, but do not stray too far. Hang on to Medin and Masalsk. It is my sincere wish that you hold to this course of action, so as not to bring the enemy's forces down on yourself. I was flattered by his reliance on me, but as for his timid advice not to draw the enemy's attention to myself, that is to say, on Kaluga and its reluctant governor, that I disregarded. On the evening of the 10th, I received an order from the commander of the Kaluga militia to take under my command the Cossack regiments I had requested earlier, and also Major Krapovitsky, who had already joined my group. On the 11th, we went to a church service attended by a multitude of people and civil servants and set off on our campaign, accompanied by the blessings of all the inhabitants. We were joined by retired midshipman Nicholas Krapovitsky, the 60-year-old private counselor Tatarinov, and the surveyor Makarevich. The other landowners stayed behind, content to parade their hunting clothes and sporting sabers and pistols tucked into their belts. Towards nightfall, we reached Znamensko and joined up with elements of the 1st Bug and Teptayarsky regiments, the first numbering 60 and the second 110 men. Through an unexpected turn of events, we had graduated from what might be called a gang of bandits to a well-organized raiding party. On 12th September, I decided to extend our operations as far as the town of Vyazma. My heart leapt at the sight of my regiments, stretched out on the march. With 130 horsemen, I had previously been able to capture 370 men with 2 officers, and free 200 of our men who had been taken prisoner, seizing 1 wagon filled with munitions and 10 others with provisions. But now, here I was, in command of 300 horsemen. What a difference! What prospects! Moreover, I was immeasurably heartened by the enthusiasm of the townsfolk and the activity of the head of the local gentry, who urged everyone to join the new militia, promised to supply my unit with provisions, and undertook to supervise the organization of a field hospital in Ukhnov. Not least, I was jubilant at the army's life-saving move towards the Smolensk highway. At sunrise, we attacked an enemy unit in sight of the town, which was escorting a transport of food supplies and artillery shells. Their resistance did not match our impetuosity, and our success exceeded all expectations. 6 officers and 270 men laid down their arms, and up to 100 of the enemy were finished off on the spot. 20 transports with provisions and 12 more containing gun carriages with artillery shells fell into our hands. Right there and then, 2 carriages with munitions and 340 muskets were turned over to retired Captain Belsky, in charge of recruiting and training new militiamen, so that from the very outset, I already had enough to equip almost 500 men in the village of Znamenskoye. On the 14th, we arrived at the village of Tepluka, situated on the Smolensk highway, and, with all due caution, settled there for the night. Here, a peasant from the town of Tsarevo came to me and offered to serve in my party. This courageous fellow, named Theodore, left behind his wife and children, who took refuge in the woods. He stayed with me until the last of the enemy was expelled from Smolensk province, and only then went home. After I returned from Paris in 1814, I stopped on purpose in Tsarevo to visit my brave comrade in arms, only to be told he was no longer alive. He had died from contagion, along with many other people who had sought refuge in the woods during the hostilities. What a lesson to us all! Those who seek to avoid death and those who face it bravely often share the same fate. Each is allotted a certain amount of time. What is the point of trying to hide and court disgrace? That evening we encountered marauders, and because we were so carefully hidden, we were able to grab them without any resistance, almost one after another. By 10 o'clock we had taken 70 men and 2 officers, one of whom had his pockets filled with looted seals, penknives, and other stuff. It has to be said, however, that this officer was not French but from Westphalia. On the morning of the 15th, around 8 o'clock, our sentries on duty spotted a large number of carriages with white covers on their way from the village of Tarbayev. Some of us jumped on horseback and saw them as they moved along like a sailing fleet. In the blink of an eye, hussars and Cossacks galloped to cut them off. The first in line attacked those escorting the convoy, and after a few pistol shots they scattered in flight. Then, when cornered by the Bug regiment, they laid down their arms. 260 men from different regiments with their horses, 2 officers, and 20 carriages filled with bread, oats, and harnesses fell into our hands. Up to now, all my operations had taken place between Gzhatsk and Vyazma. Their success prompted the French governor to take action. He gathered all available mounted units, organized a strong force composed of 2,000 men, 8 officers, and 1 staff officer, with instructions to clear the area between these 2 towns, to destroy my group, and bring me back to Vyazma dead or alive. I had already been informed of this disrespectful step on the 13th, and when we captured the enemy transport on the 15th, I was told by a peasant horseman that this force had already reached Fedorovsk. I did all I could to avoid it by adopting evasive maneuvers. My unit set out from Tepluka and followed the road to Shuisky. After a while, the road follows a wooded valley and veers sharply to the right, crosses the highway out of sight of Tepluka, and continues to Rumyantsevo and Andreevskoye. There, after spending the night in great secrecy, we proceeded at a quickened pace to the village of Pokrovskoye, which was some 5 versts from the highway, about 3 miles. A verst equals approximately 2/3 of a mile. My movements were based on 3 suppositions. Either the detachment assigned to take action against me, having lost contact, would resume their march towards Moscow, or by chasing me from Dorogobuj to Gzhatsk and back again, they would exhaust their horses and give me the opportunity to defeat them with less trouble. Or perhaps, by splitting their forces in an effort to surround me, this would enable me to defeat them piecemeal. On the evening of the 18th, as we arrived at the village of Pokrovsko, a peasant, having come from the main highway, told me that he had seen a foot soldier running from a transport of Russian prisoners who had spent the night in the village of Yurenev and had now settled for the night at Nikolskoye, between Yurenev and Pokrovskoye. I asked the man if he could possibly bring this soldier to me. He answered that he could, but because he was afraid to go there alone, he requested one of my Cossacks to accompany him. I gave him orderly Khrushchev, and they set off together. A couple of hours before daybreak on the 19th, the two of them came back with the soldier in question. He reported to me that 1,000 Russian prisoners had stopped in Yurenev, that some of them were locked up in the church, and that the rest were spending the night in various huts in the village where up to 300 men of their French escort were also quartered. I ordered my men to saddle up, and as our party got underway, Khrushchev told me how, as the three of them approached Nikolskoye, they had met a passerby who told them he had seen a band of vandals enter the village and did not dare go near it. Khrushchev, having questioned him closely as to where the soldiers were being kept, therefore put on peasant clothing and entered the village, which was full of French soldiers, located the hut where the soldier was spending the night, woke him up and brought him back. This brave deed increased our respect for Khrushchev and placed me under the pleasant obligation of reporting the incident to our commander-in-chief. We skirted Nikolskoye and stopped a short distance from Yurenev. There was still about an hour left before sunrise. Unfortunately, while our party was on the march, the prisoner transport had been rounded up and had proceeded further down the Smolensk highway, making way for 3 battalions of Polish infantry who were en route from Smolensk to Moscow. One of them settled in the village and 2 others in a bivouac behind the church. These troops were in complete confusion, which proves the lack of planning in their disposition. Having relied on the report from the soldier and assuming that there was only half of the escort in the village itself and that the other half was around the church, which held some of our prisoners, I had reviewed the situation and given orders to 60-foot soldiers who sneaked through the hollow leading to the village and broke into the main street shouting, "Hurrah, our men, this way," ready to rush the enemy with a bayonet charge. This infantry unit was under the command of ex-midshipman Krapovitsky. At the same time, the Bug Regiment was supposed to skirt the village from the other side and occupy the open space between the village and the church so as to cut off any possibility of retreat for the survivors. My original detachment and the Teptiarsky Regiment had been left in reserve and deployed half hidden near the woods, under instructions to keep the highway to Vyazma open by constant patrols. My operation was carried out with great punctuality but not with the success I had expected. Our infantrymen, having burst into the village after their silent approach, found, instead of our prisoners and a small escort, a strong enemy battalion that quickly recovered from its initial surprise. A lively exchange of gunfire ensued in the street and from the surrounding windows. Our heroic lads held fast and managed to charge at bayonet point to the arranged meeting place with the Bug Regiment. But in 5 minutes, out of the original 60 men, 35 lay dead or mortally wounded. In the meantime, the Chechensky and Bug regiments completely cut off the enemy battalion, which was awaiting reinforcements in the hope of holding its position in the village by keeping up its fire from the huts and orchards. Thirsting for revenge, I asked for volunteers to set fire to the village buildings still occupied by the enemy. My call was immediately answered by the 25 brave survivors of the original group. The peasant huts caught fire quickly, and over 200 men were engulfed by flames. A terrible cry went up, but it was too late. Facing certain death, the soldiers began to run out in every direction. The Chechensky regiment hit them hard, capturing 119 men and 1 captain. The remains of the battalion regrouped, were attacked several times, and managed to retreat in good order towards the other 2 battalions, which were streaming from the church to their aid. As soon as they showed up, I ordered a gradual retreat, realizing that there was nothing else to be done at that moment. One of the patrols we had sent towards Vyazma came back and reported the presence of an artillery park located about 3 versts from the scene of the fighting, beyond the highway. After conveying our wounded to Pokrovskoye under the escort of the Teptiarsky Regiment, I made for the park at full speed with the remaining troops and captured it without any resistance. It consisted of 24 carriages, 144 draft oxen, and 23 drivers. The rest escaped into the woods. Having returned from my half-successful expedition to Pokrovskoye, I was at least consoled by the fact that the raids we had carried out on the Smolensk highway and the experience gathered there drew the commander-in-chief's attention to my original proposal and that light detachments of troops were set aside to conduct diversionary operations on the enemy's lines of communication. We had hardly time to settle down in Pokrovskoye when I received news that a fresh transport of about 400 Russian prisoners had stopped not far away from us. Having already been punished once for daring to storm a village occupied by infantry, I sent forward orderly Khrushchev with 6 hand-picked men and directed them to approach the village, fire a few pistol shots, and disappear quickly so as to alarm the convoy and force it to seek a quieter spot to settle in. The rest of our group followed Khrushchev in secrecy and remained in ambush, awaiting the exit of the convoy from the village. Complete success crowned our enterprise. Hardly had the shots been fired by Khrushchev and his Cossacks before their hasty retreat, than the whole convoy began to pull away from the village. After giving the enemy time to proceed about 500 yards, my party climbed the hill and charged down on the hapless convoy. The prisoners gave a helping hand to the attackers, and the entire escort of 166 men and 4 officers was quickly disarmed. We returned to Pokrovskoye with our prize and settled in for the night. On the morning of the 20th, we moved to Gorodistche, where we could rest and also inspect the levies of the new militia formed at Znamensky. Besides, I was now laden with spoils. I found I had 908 men, 14 officers, 36 gun carriages, 40 supply wagons, 144 draft oxen, and about 200 horses, from which I chose the best to replace the poor mounts of the Cossacks. The rest I apportioned out among the peasants. Since Gorodistche was 15 versts away from the Smolensk highway, and therefore not under direct threat from enemy attack, my unit split into 2 groups. The Bug Regiment occupied the village of Lugi, 5 versts further on from Gorodistche, where I remained with the rest of my party. Observation posts were set up on the 2 main roads, and patrols were sent out twice a day to a distance of 3 or 4 versts. In the meantime, I selected 250 men from the 400 prisoners we had freed and added the remains of my infantry to these, which I baptized the Heroes' Half Battalion. Men were transferred to it only if they had distinguished themselves, and in this way, the outfit gradually grew to 2 battalions. The remaining 150 men were sent on to Znamenesko and named the Honorary Half Company, urging the new militia to emulate them. On the 21st early in the day, I visited Znamenesko, where I already found about 500 men under arms. Belsky explained to me that the other 1,500, also armed with captured muskets, were quartered in several neighboring villages and were ready to gather in Znamenesko at the first notice. He assured me that the villagers were so keen that in case of need, we could rapidly muster up to 6,000 men, but these could only be armed with picks and axes instead of muskets. Shock seemed to have inspired people with renewed impetus, and there was a fresh sense of purpose, as if the whole world were threatening us. I wanted to do even more, but had to be content with what had been achieved. It is to our people's credit that in this whole region, the only traitors to be found were the servants of retired Major Semen Vishner, and 2 peasants, Efim Nikiforov and Sergei Martinov. The servants joined up with French marauders and killed their master. Nikiforov also enlisted the French to help kill retired Lieutenant Danilo Ivanov, and Martinov pointed out wealthy citizens to the enemy, who killed the governor of Gorodistche, plundered the church, dug up the remains of a local female landowner, and opened fire on the Cossacks. When my party arrived there, they all took flight and disappeared, but we finally apprehended the last rascal on the 14th. This captive was more important to me than 200 Frenchmen. I immediately reported the matter to the commander of the militia and prepared to carry out exemplary punishment. On the 21st, the order came for me to execute this criminal by firing squad, and within the hour, I sent out a notice to all the villages within 10 versts for the locals to gather at Gorodistche. 4 priests from neighboring villages were invited to attend. On the morning of the 22nd, the condemned man made his confession, was dressed in a white blouse, and led under guard to that very church that he had plundered with our enemies. The priests stood in front of the church, in line with the firing squad, and behind them stood the populace, and our whole group under arms. The criminal was placed on his knees, facing the priests. A memorial service was sung while he was still alive. Did he hope for forgiveness? Was he hardened by evil? Or had despair driven all feelings from him? During the service, he did not cross himself even once. When it was over, I ordered him to bow in all four directions, and he did so. I directed the people and my unit to make way. He looked at me without any comprehension, but finally, when I had him taken aside and gave the order to place a hood over his eyes, he began to tremble. The squad came to attention and fired all at once. Afterwards, my troops dispersed the spectators. There were no other traitors or plunderers, but some who had disobeyed the authorities. I had a list of these, called out their names, and had them whipped. After the punishment had been carried out, Sep Karpovitsky read out an announcement. This will be punished on all godless people, traitors to our commander, and those who disobey our authorities. Remember that the army may be away for a time, but our Tsar, our Orthodox Lord, will find out where evil has been perpetrated. Let the least infringement or disorder, the least pluck to punish all godless people and traitors as we have done today with this scoundrel. There is no room for him on this sacred ground. Bury him in the robber hollow. Then Father John, raising the cross, said, Let any man who disobeys the constituted authorities be cursed, an enemy of God, and a traitor to the Tsar and fatherland. Let him be cursed. After that, I led to the assembly the same instructions I had given to the Tokarevo villagers and dismissed them. In the evening, I sent a courier with a report about the success of my search and the punishment of the above criminal. On the 23rd, in the morning, I learned of the death of my benefactor, the noble Prince Peter Ivanovich Bagration. Fate forsook Russia without his protection, and also awarded me the satisfaction to honor him by defeating the enemy the moment this news arrived. A lookout post had been set up, and in the morning the scouts let me know that a strong enemy column was on the march towards Gorodisha. I decided to let it approach quite quickly and have them forced before the Tepitarsky regiment and the Bug regiment with the infantry into a deep hollow, half a verst in front of Gorodisha. My detachments lay well concealed, while I took a small guard to a hill and was in sight of the enemy, waiting for them to attack at full range. The enemy had no cover to assist its mate. Although it was marching quickly, it was not aware that I was lying in wait, but several companies, as soon as they had gone past my hiding place on both flanks, cut them into two columns, but released only the main body, well concealed behind the buildings. Having organized the defense of the village, I did not want to satisfy myself that the enemy was worthy of such a sophisticated plan. Soon, I spotted a unit of about 400 foot soldiers. At first, they appeared to be aiming for Gorodisha, but when our sharpshooters let off several shots and slightly injured my columns, they decided to pass by. At that point, I realized that this mob had no evil designs on us, and in fact, it turned out that they were none other than a large band of marauders. I ordered the sharpshooters to press on, and for the infantry to follow them. At this moment, we saw Sep Karpovitsky charging at full speed with his cavalry. The enemy made for the nearest grove and my men after them. The roar of firing and shouts of hurrah fused together. The grove adjoined the river Ugra, and there are shallows, and beyond the river stretched dense woods all the way to Masalsk. It appeared that our prey was about to escape, but Karpovitsky, who was born and bred in Orlov, and on this occasion demonstrated an intimate knowledge of local topography with his great military talents, immediately skirted the trees and positioned himself between them and the river, just as our infantry rushed onto the bridge. The enemy, seeing inevitable disaster, began to throw down their weapons and surrender. I ordered them to be given quarter, convinced that the greatest curse I could show to the memory of my heroic benefactor was to be merciful. Then we saw Chechensky galloping towards us with his regiment to offer help. He had been told that we had been defeated and hemmed in with our backs to the river. His surprise was only equaled by his glee to see that we were victorious. The division had completely yielded, 330 men and 5 officers. The main leaders of our unit, and the main pursuers, Sep Karpovitsky, had distinguished himself in this affair. Upon our return to the village, we held a brief service in memory of Prince Bagration and proceeded to march home. On the 6th, I received orders to detach the Tepitarsky regiment with the entire 2nd Battalion and to make joint operations with a detachment of militia from Kaluga, which was formed to protect the government center of Orlov. This was painful for me to obey. The rest of my forces remained in position and, without delay, carried out a raid along from Smolensk along the road to Orlov. As without any decisive victory, we had to halt and withdraw back, without obtaining all our objectives. During the 8th and 9th, I was engaged in detailed and vigilant direction of our raids. We had seen several days without success between Vyazma and Smolensk, but I again pressed the attack in that area and took various positions that had been used as stores for our action. I continued towards Hodorkov and the strategic settings at Sukhinovo. My vanguard opened fire outside Vyazma itself, and I split the party, as usual, into 3 groups, with only the heads of the columns visible. We soon heard the beating of drums and spotted the enemy infantry, which began to answer our musket fire, but did not venture out of the city. This suited me, and remaining where we were until evening, we lit our bivouac fires and retreated under cover during the night to Losmino. On the 26th, we reached Andreyani, and I sent 2 peasants into Pokrovskoye to get information on the enemy detachment. Within 4 hours, 2 lads galloped over from Losmino with the news that the French were on their way from Vyazma, marching in the direction of Gzhatsk. My wishes were being granted. Our party immediately headed for Monin. Towards evening, we reached this village and captured 42 wagons loaded with food, 10 artillery carriages under the protection of 126 light infantrymen, and 1 officer. This group was part of the detachment sent at the double to overtake us. The captured officer told me that my opposite number, frustrated at his lack of success, hoped to catch us up at Gzhatsk, but failing that, was determined to pursue the search along the river Ugra so as to cut me off from Ukhnov and Kaluga. I have noticed that partisans in charge of a separate unit sometimes tend to get the notion that they are military leaders in command of an entire army. Hence, their overriding thought is how to cut off the opposition from the rest of the army, and to occupy positions favored by Austrian tacticians. It cannot be emphasized too strongly, however, that the best strategy for a group of partisans is to be continually on the move, leaving the enemy in the dark as to its true location and keeping their sentries constantly on the alert. Meanwhile, patrols must be active in guarding the group to ensure it is never cut off or surrounded, operating in accordance with the maxim of "live to fight another day." My opponent was clearly unaware of this essential truth of partisan warfare, and that is why I was able to cope with him so easily. Having sent our captives and booty into town, as previously, we continued towards the highway and lingered there uneventfully for a couple of days. On the 29th, we arrived in Andreyani, where I was met by the courier who had returned from army headquarters. He brought me various papers and informed me that we would soon be reinforced by the Cossacks of the 13th Regiment under Popov, which indeed joined us in Andreyani on 1st October. This regiment, despite forced marches all the way from the Don, appeared to me in the best possible shape, and now that my group was strengthened by 500 well-mounted Cossacks, I stopped worrying about the detachment in pursuit of us and decided to attack it myself. Before that, however, I wanted to retrain and sharpen these new troops, who now constituted the better half of my unit, whereas it had been possible to operate with a small party as if they were a band of outlaws, without strict discipline, and relying mostly on rough informality. This could no longer be continued with 700 men. And so, for the next few days, I had to spend time on internal reorganization and preparing the group for battle. I gave them practical examples of how best to attack, pursue, and withdraw. For the first time, I tried out the scattered retreat, so essential for a party composed solely of Cossacks in the event of an attack by a superior force. At my first signal, the men had to scatter over the whole field of action. At the next signal, everyone had to gallop out of sight of the enemy. Finally, after each man had ridden a few versts in a particular direction, he would have to find his way to a rendezvous, chosen in advance, sometimes 10 or even 20 versts from the battlefield. That concludes the 10th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.